Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Z. Welcome to the Age of Nationalism, Part 3. So far, we've covered what nationalism is in the 19th century and the Risorgimento in Italy. Now we are going to head to the German states. So you remember what the Zollverein is. We have talked about this before, right? It is the customs union between the German states. And an economic connection between those states with lower tariffs, right? That starts to form a business administration that starts to make people think, yes, perhaps these states can come together. So we're not going to spend too much time on that. But one of the things that this leads us to is this idea that Germany, as one historian has said, is a nation in search of a state, right? That if the Zollverein is their first sort of economic / governmental tariff, right, connection, right? What makes Germany a nation, right? And a lot of historians would point to, as we've talked about when we talked about nationalism, is the folk tales, like the Grimm's fairy tales, the idea that everyone speaks German, right? That there's a common language, a common shared history, right? And that feeling of being German, of Germanness, exists, right? And that it exists long before the nation comes together, right? It exists well through the 19th century. And okay, so geographically, we also need to talk about a couple things, right? I just want us to get a sense of things. Here's Prussia, okay? Austria. This is what's going to be called the Southern German Confederation versus the Northern German Confederation, okay? Then also, like up here, Schleswig and Holstein, right? Now this is part of Denmark. These are contested regions where they were Danish, but there's German-speaking people that live there, right? Therefore, Germans are thinking, this should be Germany. Austria, there's German-speaking people there, right? Same with Alsace and Lorraine, right? Traditionally French regions, but there's German-speaking people living there, right? So the whole idea behind sort of German nationalism, right, is this idea of a unification of the German people, right? That there's a German national identity already, right? And that those people should be brought together. So in the sense of it being a nation in search of a state, right, that sense of Germanness exists, right? Plus we have the Zollverein. But everybody was like gung-ho for German national unity. Okay. The German national unity actually comes because of wars against the Danes and the Austrians, okay, and the French. So there's 3 wars that sort of bring Germany together, and we'll talk about those as we move forward. There's this group of elite landed nobility called the Junkers, okay, that they don't want any change that might threaten their status quo. Like there's a whole group of people that are afraid of this. Upper classes are fearing the growing nationalism because they don't want any more revolutions, right? And they're also fearing a proclamation of equality between all people, right? Because the idea of, well, who is German, who gets to be equal, right? How are we going to totally change the social stratification, or are we going to be able to kind of keep the status quo? There's also 2 different ideas on how Germany should come together. One is called small Germany, right? The idea that Prussia is going to be dominant, and that Austria will not be part of Germany. Then there's big Germany, right? The idea that Austria would be dominant and that the German Confederation would include Austria. However, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is multinational. It's embroiled in a bunch of wars, right? Its Habsburg monarchy had an awful lot to lose if it started to encourage national movements like German unification. So the big Germany idea in the end is going to lose out. And the small Germany idea is the idea that we're going to see actually come into fruition. The Junkers, of course, feared big Germany because their power would then be suppressed by Austrian elites. And most nationalists felt that Prussia should dominate. So just like our discussion with Italy and the different ways that people imagined German unification would go, there definitely were a diversity of ideas. A major character in the German national movement is Otto von Bismarck, and he is known for the idea of Realpolitik. So let's talk a little bit about Realpolitik. Okay, so right from Wikipedia, it tells us that while this has a negative connotation in current American politics, okay, it is particularly associated with the 19th century, okay, idea of nationalism. It also, right, its policies were employed in response to the failed revolutions of 1848 as a means to strengthen states and tighten social order. So Otto von Bismarck was the first chancellor. You can think of that as like a prime minister to Kaiser Wilhelm I from the Kingdom of Prussia. And he used this idea of Realpolitik in his quest to achieve Prussian dominance. How did he do that? Here's 3 examples. First, Schleswig-Holstein, right? Those Danish territories, right? This question, and in questioning, there's Germans living there, but they're Danish. It's Danish territories, right? He used this question to antagonize other countries and cause wars if necessary in order to achieve his goals, right? And in fact, it's not just the wars with the Danes and the Austrians, but also for the Franco Prussian War, right? He's willing to go to war to form a country, right? So that is an example of Realpolitik. Another example, willingness to adopt some social policies of the socialists, like employee insurance and pensions for retirees. These small changes from the top down kept everybody quiet and happy, right? So that there wouldn't be any major revolutions from the bottom up. So keep the people happy with some socialist policies, right? But keep doing what you're doing as a nationalist. Sound familiar? It's coming, right? The 1920s. And then Prussia's seemingly illogical move of not demanding territory from a defeated Austria, and they had a war in with Austria after the Danish War. And they said, no, we don't want any territory from Austria. But you're going to give some of that territory back to the Italians, right? So that's how the Italians won the Veneto. But this later led to the unification of Germany and is cited as an example of Realpolitik as well. So Bismarck also is famous for this idea of blood and iron, and it comes from a speech that he made where, let's listen to it here. It says, the position of Prussia in Germany will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. Prussia must concentrate its strength. Prussia was known, by the way, for its army, and hold it. Since the treaties of Vienna, our frontiers have been ill-designed for a healthy body politic. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. And so this whole idea, right, he later becomes known as the Iron Chancellor, and he is willing to resort to war, right, the letting of blood, in order to further German unification, right, that, this isn't going to happen without some sort of national violent revolution. So how does all of this happen? Okay, let's look at a map. So we've got Schleswig and Holstein up here. Again, the question is, there's Germans living in this area, but the Danish are in charge of it, right? So Prussia and the Austrians get together and say, hey, that's not cool. They go to war with the Danish and they win. But then in trying to figure out who gets what territory, the Prussians want everything. Therefore, they go to war with the Austrians and they end up winning it all. Okay. And so this then also, Bismarck reestablishes the national parliament and universal male suffrage. So in doing this, right, he then says, okay, I'm going to give the liberals some reforms. Everyone's going to be happy, right? We got all the territory. We're keeping everybody happy because we're giving everybody just a little bit of what they want, right? And after the war, he establishes the North German Confederation. So that's these red and green territories that you see up here. All right. Then the Prussians go to war with the French in the Franco Prussian War. Okay. And we'll talk about that a little bit later and the causes of it. But one of the results of it is that these two territories, Alsace and Lorraine, again, where German-speaking, German ethnic people live, they're actually pretty happy being part of France, but it doesn't matter for them because the Prussians won. The Prussians take that territory. In doing so, this forces the South German Confederation to then be absorbed into the North German Confederation. Now Germany looks like this, and at Versailles, it's off the map, um, after, because the Germans took Paris during the Franco Prussian War, they then, Bismarck goes and proclaims the German nation as a nation, right, in 1871, and they actually become a nation. So let's talk about this Franco-Prussian War. So it's 1870 to 1871, right? After Prussia has had wars with Denmark and with Austria, the two sides of the Franco-Prussian War, the North German Confederation, led by Prussia, and the Second French Empire. And I call this a proxy war for German unification, right? Because the real impetus for the Prussians was to get South German Confederation to join them, right? They wanted to unify as much of that territory as possible. And the French, though, declared war first. And the Prussians just kind of got on the bandwagon and were like, oh, cool, now we have a war. The French were really worried that, because Prussia had annexed Luxembourg and a couple other smaller territories on their border. So the French were like, oh, Germany is growing. German unification is growing. They're going to dominate the continent. Like, you know, Napoleon Bonaparte fears, right? So the Prussians, of course, are very happy that the French declare war, because now they have a reason to go to war with France. They see this, and he uses this. Bismarck uses this as a means to get the South German Confederation to become part of them. What do we take away from this? One, Prussian dominance. The Prussians, a neat story that comes out of this war is that the Prussians sent landscape painters to France before the war to start to paint. And so like all these French like see these German painters and they're like, oh, isn't that nice? There's a bunch of artists on our hillsides, right, painting pictures. Oh no, they were spies. They were mapping out the territory so that when the troops came in, they had a better lay of the land, which I think was pretty brilliant. But Germany had railroads. They had better technology. They had better weapons. Like their industrial revolution was a lot stronger in the sense of heavy industry than France's, which we remember is connected to luxury goods, right? Luxury goods aren't going to do you much good in a war. So the Prussians make it all the way to Paris. They take Paris. The Parisians are totally upset. They are just really, they think that, you know, the French Empire just really bungled this whole thing. And they revolt and cause the Paris Commune, where basically Paris later on becomes an independent state for a couple months. And it's a real point of pride for Parisians, you know, but it's a result of this war. Alsace and Lorraine, as I said, become German. Germany as a nation, right, is declared at Versailles. And, you know, this is the second time, by the way, that Versailles is going to be really important as we move forward in time. This changes the way everybody sees Germany. Right now, we knew Prussia was a dominant force, but now we see Germany as a really, really dominant factor. And here's a painting in Versailles, right, of the declaration of the German state at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. Okay, so thank you very much, and stay tuned for the next part, where we are going to be talking a little bit about French nationalism, the Dreyfus Affair, the Crimean War, and we'll wrap everything up. Okay, see you then.